I have a very special interview lined up today. We're going to be talking with Melinda Schwakhofer about some of her art, some of her career, and just a lot of really interesting topics that I think are really timely in today's atmosphere of COVID and the different things going on in Indian country, and how we're going to really talk about how her art has been just this vessel for healing and a way to express all the things that many of us kind of feel and can get all tied down by it every day. So welcome, Melinda. Can you tell us who you are and where you're from, or where you're at right now? Because I'm pretty excited. This is our first kind of international interview.
Yes, well, I'm Melinda Schwakhofer, and Meadow for inviting me to have a conversation with you about my artwork. I'm coming to you from a little town called Martin Hampstead in Dartmoor. It's in a national park called Dartmoor in a county called Devon in England, and we have a population of about 1,500. I'm originally from Southern California, and I moved to Great Britain about 22 years ago. I was in Scotland for several years and then moved down to Devon about 10 years ago.
And she's a Muskogee Creek citizen, and so she's coming to us to really talk about her art. One of your pieces has recently won a pretty prestigious award here in Oklahoma, which is really kind of awesome, given that we've had COVID and our art showings have been kind of delayed or canceled. Can you kind of tell us about your Road to Oklahoma piece?
Yes, well, okay, Road to Oklahoma. I bought the fabric to make that quilt 4 years ago now, and I've had the idea in my head for a long time. It took me 9 months to make. I started making it in July 2019 and finished it this March. And I did enter it in the Trail of Tears art show. It was juried in, which I was very proud about. And the show, as you know, was originally due to go ahead in April, but because of COVID, it was postponed. And it went into an online show in July this year. And I'm just very proud that it won second place in its category. It was in the diverse category. And it's now at the Living Arts of Tulsa exhibition, Speak While You Can, which was curated by Roy Boney and Tony Tiger.
Awesome. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about the components of that piece that really, I've seen it online and looked in your gallery on your website, and it really just kind of has just a lot of different elements going on. And it's interesting because every time I think I've pulled the picture up, I've noticed something different.
Well, that's great, because I do have a lot going on in a lot of my artwork, and I do have a video about it, which I'll ask you to share the link with people because it tells the whole story. Yeah. But it's quite a large quilt, and it's called Road to Oklahoma for two reasons. The Road to Oklahoma is an established quilt pattern that was done by settler women in the late 1800s. And the Road to Oklahoma, as you know, is the road that the 5 tribes were forced to walk to go to Indian Territory. So it's got kind of a double layered meaning. And when you look at the quilt, on the left-hand side of it, it's the traditional Road to Oklahoma pattern. I've got it, which way am I going? Behind me up here is the Road to Oklahoma star pattern. Mm-hmm. And so that's on the sort of western or left-hand side of the quilt. And I kind of see it also as a map of the United States. And on the quilt, as you travel eastwards or to the right-hand side of it, I've got sun circles, which are on it. And that's the traditional Mississippian motifs. And inside of each of the squares and the sun circles, I've got maps or photographs or Dawes roll cards printed onto fabric, parts of speeches. I've got some words from Andrew Jackson, and I've got land for sale posters. I've got allotment maps. So every star in the quilt has something that's meaningful to the Muskogee people, all of the 5 tribes really, but I really wanted this to be about the Creeks Road to Oklahoma. And it's also got a lot of my personal family history, which I've been on a journey on. And I say it took me 9 months to make the quilt, but it took me 20 years to make, because grew up not knowing very much about our people or my dad's story. And I've been putting the pieces of the puzzle together for many years. And my artwork kind of helps coalesce all of it.
Yeah, and I think so many of us can really kind of identify with that, especially as some of us are from blended backgrounds where and then assimilation, it really kind of was instructed to do that to the people. And so how has this kind of accumulation of information and then channeling it into art really like overall, what's that done for you personally?
Well, it's really helped me find my identity as a Muskogee person. And as you say, there's a blending. And I used to think of it as, I mean, a lot of people say part Indian, part Muskogee, part whatever tribe we're from. But I sort of see myself as a confluence, and where two rivers come together, and having it inside of me. So it's really helped me learn about my identity, learn about my family story, learn about our tribal story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the quilt that I've got on this side is the first one that I made, and I made this one in 2000. I started making it in 2008, and it took me a couple of years to finish because it's a lot of this work's a bit emotionally hard. Um, and I at that point I learned about the removals. I learned about the creek removals, which we all of the tribes had different stories and different ways things happen. And I was like, how am I going to talk about this? How am I going to make sense of it? And I thought I'll make a quilt. I'll make some artwork. And I wrote the haiku on it, which is, the winter trees wept a river of blood when we were torn from the land. And I was also kind of thinking about, it was not only us that left our homelands, but when we lived there, we looked after the land. We took care of it. We lived with it. We didn't own it and carve it up and profit from it. And I was thinking, what must it be like for the land that these people who had lived there for thousands of years and cared for it were no longer there? Also at that time, I'd been living in Scotland, and I'd taken a few trips out to the Scottish Highlands, and the land there, the people there had been removed. And I mean, ironically, they were sent to North America, and some of them displaced, some of the tribes on the East Coast and the eastern part. But I could feel this sadness in the land that the people that had lived there were gone when I was up in Scotland. And so I think when I put this quilt together, I was putting a lot of everything into it.
There's a lot of like spiritual kind of, elements to those concepts. And can you kind of give us a little bit of your background on how you really started, working with art and using it as those kind of healing elements? Because I've really kind of like read over, your bio, and you talk about that healing element through artwork. And where did that kind of, what was the genesis of that for you?
Okay, well, that's a really interesting question, Angel. I have always been a creative person my whole life. And in my 20s and early 30s, I was trying painting and pastels and different things, and nothing ever really hit the spot. I was living in Southern California at the time. And in 1996, I think it was, there was a quilt shop near my house that I used to drive past every day.
Mm-hmm.
And one day I went in, and when I came out, I bought a secondhand sewing machine, which I still have. And I'd signed up for a sampler bed quilt class. And so that kind of started me off. And I felt like when I started working with textiles and fabrics, that really was what I'd been looking for. And what I love about working with textiles and fabrics is it's textural, it's visual, it's sensuous, you can feel it. And if you make mistakes, you can just cut it up and splice in new bits of fabric. So it just worked for me on so many different levels. Mm-hmm. And then the sort of the healing part of it came. I've also, my academic background is in counseling psychology. I've got a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in counseling psych. And I just putting together mental well-being and artwork just made so much sense to me. I've never studied art therapy, but when I was living in Devon, when I moved down to Devon in 2006, I did a year-long foundation course called Art and Mental Health. And I really learned a lot about how artwork is so good for people's mental health and well-being. And I just, I've got a lot of artwork. I recently put my website together, and I was like, wow, I've done a lot over the past 25 or so years. But so many of the pieces I look at, I'm like, oh yeah, I was going through that in my life, and I made a quilt to make sense of it or to try to figure things out.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that you've been so creative for so long, because that's really prevalent in going through your website. And I was like, first I was blown away to find all this wonderful textile artwork. And then I'm like, oh, how awesome. She paints and does photography and everything. Can you kind of like talk us through like some of the different things that you've been into? Because I feel like it just kind of encompasses everything.
Yeah. Um, okay, so I found myself artistically with textiles, and I kind of focused on that for about probably 5 or 6 years. And then there came a point, I also got my first camera in about 2007. I'd never had a camera before. I used to borrow other people. So I got a camera, and I really found I love photography. And it's interesting because some people say, oh, photographers distance themselves from the world because you're looking at a camera. But bless you, I find that a camera kind of takes me into things and it draws me into the world. So I find the opposite of the sort of stereotypical distanced camera person. And then I had some fun combining that with fabrics and learning how to print onto fabric. I stopped making textile work probably about 6 or 7 years ago. And it wasn't any conscious decision, but I started doing a drawing class. A woman who lives in my village taught a drawing class. So I started doing that with her. And I took up painting a little bit, went back to pastels. And the way that I look at it now, when I want to make something, it more often than it being a visual response to something, it comes from in here, or it might be a visual something that I see that comes inside. And I just know I need to make it into something and take it back out into the world. And sometimes it needs to be photography, sometimes it needs to be a painting or drawing, sometimes it needs to be textile. So I kind of ask my idea what it needs to be. And a lot of times I learn new techniques. I'm always learning a new technique with every piece that I make, so I can figure out how do I make that visual thing work.
So I really kind of wanted to ask next about some of your recent work that you kind of shared with us with your mask that has, you know, traditional Muskogee language on it and things like that.
Okay.
What's like the most recent, I think there's one with some of the like even current topics like I can't breathe, the I can't breathe mask and
Yeah.
things like that.
Well, I'll show you. I can also send you photos of these if you want. But this is the one that I made. This one, I think it was in June when George Floyd was murdered, and I really had a strong reaction to that event. And the background of this mask that I made, it's from an engraving from 1780. It was an abolitionist movement, actually in Plymouth, not far from where I live. And it's the background of it is an engraving of a slave ship, and they just packed people in like literally like sardines. And
it's like an image I remember seeing in our history books as little kids when we were taught about like how they treated, you know, people and stuff.
Yeah.
So I noticed that, and I was like, that was something that just kind of jumped out in my mind.
Yeah, and then that phrase "I can't breathe," which George Floyd uttered as he was killed, and I'm sorry, I'm not so good with names, but there was another African American man who had said the same thing a few years ago. And I was just thinking about the slave ship and these people packed in, they couldn't breathe, and the brutality and slavery and the history of slavery that I think is still not acknowledged or addressed the way that it should be, and the brutality that still goes on today. So that was that mask. I have been part of a Facebook group called Breathe for Indigenous Makers Making Masks. And one of the first ones I made, I was like, oh, I don't bead, and I'm just going to do this because I have to. And this was the one I made for that. Excuse my pronunciation, but Eshte Muskogee Oes, I am Muskogee. And the background of this has the words printed onto fabric, part Indian, half-breed savage. And these are the words my dad heard used to label himself when he was a boy and young man growing up in Oklahoma. He was born in Muskogee in 1920, and a lot of racism. He felt very ashamed about being part Indian, and his Austrian American father never accepted him. So he brought that into our family. The other sort of Muskogee themed masks I made for Breathe, this is one called Hisakata, which is breath, life, and they're double-sided. And this is that really beautiful, it's kind of a wind or a whirlpool motif, Mississippian. I love this design. And a couple of others that I've got. this the image that the two men facing each other on this one, those are from a Cado design, which was found carved into a whelk shell. And I have these two men facing each other, and then the breath, and it's called We Breathe Together. And this is painted on mulberry bark with some beads and kind of a natural fiber for the ties that go around the head. And then finally, I really love this one. This was a rattlesnake gorget that I found in one of the books that I've got. And I just made these two snakes mirroring each other.
Awesome. So what goes into getting these images onto the fabric? I'm kind of curious about this. I'm like looking at it, I'm like, I've never seen fabric like this. This must be part of the process.
Right. Well, some of it I printed onto fabric. On the on this mask, I put fabric through the printer. On the one with the two rattlesnake gorgets, I drew it freehand with a pencil and got it right, and then I did it with a fabric pen. I really love Photoshop. I use Photoshop quite a lot to compose, and I'm really getting into printing on fabric.
So, my daughter is an enormous fan of your turtles. She's a big turtle fan to begin with for anything, so she loves that painting. I'm really, I think the first piece that I seen of yours on your website that really just kind of just gripped me, very steadfast and kind of really got my attention was um, the one with the red shoes. But can you tell me about that piece and its, history and how you've kind of learned and developed and dealt with personal things through that?
Yeah, okay, that piece is called My Grandmother's Shoes, and I made that for a show in Tahlequah. Is that Tahlequah? Is that the right pronunciation?
Tahlequah?
Tahlequah, that's it, Tahlequah.
Yeah.
It was called Breaking the Silence, MMIW, Me Too. And I started with a map for that one, and I found this map of, it was before Oklahoma, before statehood, and Indian Territory was still Indian Territory, but on this map, there were all these all these colors on the western side of the state, and it was done by a geological survey. So they were looking at all of the ore and all the minerals they could find. So they're already starting to look at this land and, oh, what's there that we can get our hands on. And I was also very aware of missing and murdered Indigenous women. I had learned a lot about the man camps and the extractive industries and the link with violence against Native American women. Mm-hmm. And so this piece is called My Grandmother's Shoes. I've written a poem. I'm not sure if I do have the poem on it. And so on this map, I'd also, when I was doing some research online, I found these satin shoes with rhinestone heels, and they were originally from a department store in Houston in the 1920s. And they were like something really fancy that a flapper would wear to a dance or something. And I just put all of these elements together. And this is a very personal part of the story because my grandmother, my dad's mother, died when he was quite young. He was 8 years old when she died. She was 16 years old when she had my father. And my grandfather, Ted Schwakhofer, he was also 16. My dad got his father's name, obviously, but I don't think they were married. I think he was able to have the name on the birth certificate. I'm not quite sure. But I know they never lived together as husband and wife. They never parented my father together. And I don't really know very much about my grandmother's early death. My dad really didn't talk about her very much. But I wrote this poem, and I'll read it to you. Born in Indian Territory, her land was pulled out from under her. Her moccasins were taken away from her at Indian school. Rootless, ungrounded, barefoot, she walked down dusty roads, looking for home. New roads ran between boom towns and oil fields, slicing through stolen land and carving out Oklahoma. Boomer, sooner. There were too many men with too much get-rich-quick oil money and too much time on their hands. A pretty barefoot Muskogee girl, she found a pair of cast-off red satin shoes at the side of the road. Cracked and cheap, too small, they pinched her feet, but made her feel like a honky-tonk queen. Men in fast black Buicks stopped and offered her a ride to nowhere. Once she got on that ride, she could not get off. She was spirited away.
So this is so powerful to me because I think this is a trend that is still very prevalent in our communities. When we see it in the headlines all the time, women who are, indigenous, just kind of trying to get by, and then things happen to them, and it's like, they're expendable and no one really cares or looks for them. So how has that helped you kind of make kind of peace with, your family history, but then also deal with these current kind of, events that still take place?
I think just again putting all of those together, and it was a very emotional piece to make. A lot of a lot of my pieces are very personal and very emotional, and I feel, I cry, or I feel sad, or I feel angry when I make a lot of my work, and it's just sort of a vessel to put a lot of these feelings in, and a visual place to put a lot of things together. And it was bought by somebody in Tahlequah, and it obviously touched somebody else, and you're saying that it touched you, and that's it healed me to make it. It gave a place for me to put a story, not just what is a personal story to me, but a collective story for a lot of Native women, and who've had ancestors who had been done wrong by. But the other people are seeing it and responding to it. That's part of the healing of it. And that when I first started showing work, and I was like, oh, this might be a little bit too personal. Maybe I shouldn't share this. Maybe it's so personal to me, no one's going to connect to it.
Yeah.
But kind of the paradox is, the more personal I think any artist makes their work, it really touches people's hearts and souls. And that's the most powerful. And it's just having the courage to put yourself into it. And it's like, I don't want to pussyfoot around, and I don't want to waste my time making stuff if I'm not going to put my heart and soul and my guts into it. And people respond to it, and that's the payoff for me. That's why I do it.
Well, I love that you're out here doing this work, and I kind of understand that too personal thing. I write just for my personal kind of, thing, but I also write for the newspaper. Those are very different, types of things. And I always think of the personal stuff as, oh, that's just mine. I'm just going to throw that in the box. That was just kind of my therapy a little bit. But I love that you're putting your work out there, because I feel like if one or two other people see it, understand it, process it, and it raises the awareness, then it's elevating this to the consciousness of the rest of the world. And I'm very proud of you for all that work that you're doing. I kind of wanted to ask you a question about your involvement or work that you're doing with the Plymouth. Can you tell me about that project and what it is, and how you are involved?
Oh, sorry. Is that the community artwork that?
The Mayflower.
Yes. Yeah, that's very interesting. And after I started to clue you into what I'm up to, I've got a question for you.
Okay.
So Plymouth is about an hour away from where I live, and that's where the Mayflower sailed from 400 years ago. And they were planning all these big hurrah pilgrims celebrations and commemorations. And because of COVID, the numbers aren't over. They thought a lot of Americans, nothing against Americans, but they thought a lot of white Americans were going to come that are really celebrating this, and it's all had to be very subdued. I was approached by 3 artists, British artists, about, I'd say 5 or 6 months ago, and they have a huge sculpture that spells out the words "No New Worlds," and it's facing Plymouth. And they have sort of asked if I could be involved in it, and I'm still kind of feeling my way into it. And actually, after I'm done speaking with you, Angel, we've got a Zoom call with Survival International. They've got a campaign called Mayflowers Kill, and it's very hard hitting, and they talk about genocide and disease and the ripple effects of colonization that are still being felt today all across Indian country. And I'm wondering, is the Muskogee Creek Nation or are people, is it on their radar or not? Because it's like an East Coast thing, or
I haven't heard anything about this, and I'm kind of fascinated by it, and I would like to learn more. And it almost seems like something that like cultural preservation might like to weigh in on or lend advice to, or at least maybe connect with or be aware of in some way,
Hmm.
because that's an enormous it's an enormous conversation in Indigenous communities right now, especially there seems to be an increase of people who are kind of decolonizing thought processes.
Hmm.
And we're kind of seeing this emergence of young people going out and relearning history
Hmm.
without the colonial, influence. So it should definitely be a timely and, important kind of concept that people should be, getting at least an ear to the ground on for sure.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I'm not sure if they are, but I definitely want to like help facilitate connecting anybody that might want to be connected.
Well, that would be wonderful, because they've asked me to be connected, and I wasn't quite sure how. And
Mhm.
yeah, so let's continue this conversation.
Awesome, awesome. So you have the like privilege of being the native person nearby that they can kind of latch onto and
Well, I know it's a very mixed thing, because I think what we're all learning in this process, and I've got a very good friend, Dr. Stephanie Pratt, who's she's Dakota, and she lives about an hour from me. She's Dakota and Anglo American, and she lives over here, and she's been the go-to Indigenous person in Britain for a very long time. She's an art historian and an independent scholar and a really brilliant woman. Um, and we're like, well, we don't want to be the token people, and um,
yeah.
we want to do it the right way and have it be a collaboration
Oh
from the
sure, yeah.
ground up. And so it's a real learning process for all of us, actually. Yeah.
I'm kind of like really proud that we have so many Muskogee people all over the world. Like when I think about like the spatial kind of element for me, I'm seeing it from how many places our newspaper goes, and it's a lot. And it's kind of exciting for me to think that there's seeds of a Muskogee Nation all over the world. So
Yeah,
that's kind of
definitely.
fun. Well, I thank you so much for giving us your time today and talking about your art. And I want to congratulate you on your accomplishments. And I will try to like connect you with email with some folks who might be able to steer in the right direction on Mayflower topics and things like that. And I'll definitely keep sharing information and stay in touch. And I'm going to be a big fan from here on out for sure, because I just loved kind of exploring the work you did. Any final thoughts to leave anybody with?
Oh, just stay safe and keep being Muskogee.
All right. All right.